The explorer's chest. The brass padlock snapped open in Margaret's trembling hands, and inside the chest lay a human skull resting on a bed of rotted velvet, its empty sockets staring up at them as if waiting 70 years for this exact moment. Wait, before the next revelation happens, if this mystery has already captivated you, tell us where you're watching from. And to make sure you don't miss any unexpected alliances or life-changing discoveries, subscribe and join our circle. The game is about to change. Now, back to the scene. Jesus Christ, Walter breathed, stumbling backward into a tower of cardboard boxes that collapsed around him in a cascade of dust and forgotten memories. His hand clutched his chest, and Margaret dropped the lock, the metallic clatter echoing through the storage unit like a gunshot. They stood frozen in the dim fluorescent light, two people in their late 70s who had come looking for antiques to supplement their meager pension, and had instead stumbled into what looked like evidence of a crime. The skull grinned up at them, yellowed with age, a crack running along the left temple like a lightning bolt frozen in bone. "We need to call someone," Margaret whispered, but her feet wouldn't move. She'd been married to Walter for 53 years, had raised 3 children and buried one, had survived cancer and her husband's heart attack, but she had never seen a human skull. "Walter, we need to—" Wait. Walter had recovered his composure, that stubborn engineer's mind of his already working through the problem like it was a faulty carburetor. He stepped closer to the chest, squinting in the poor light. Look at it. Really look at it. Margaret forced herself to approach, her knees protesting the movement. The chest itself was extraordinary. Dark wood bound with brass fittings that had oxidized to a deep green. Strange symbols carved into the lid that looked vaguely nautical. They'd bought the entire storage unit for $300 at an auction in Portland, Maine, drawn by the auctioneer's cryptic description: Estate of Ezekiel Thorne, deceased 1952, contents unknown, sold as is. It had seemed like a gamble worth taking. Their savings had dwindled to almost nothing after Walter's medical bills, and their daughter Sarah kept sending the money they were too proud to accept. The storage unit business had become their last-ditch effort at independence, buying abandoned units, selling whatever treasures they found at flea markets and online. They'd had modest success: vintage furniture, old records, once even a collection of pristine comic books that had fetched $2,000. But nothing like this. "The velvet is disintegrated," Walter said, his voice steadier now, falling into that analytical tone he used when he was working through something. "And look at the color of the bone. This isn't recent, Maggie. This is old, really old." She looked closer, holding her breath against the musty smell rising from the chest. Walter was right. The skull had a patina to it, a depth of aging that spoke of decades, maybe centuries. And beneath it, partially obscured by the rotted fabric, she could see other objects. A leather-bound journal, its cover cracked and water-stained. What looked like navigational instruments made of brass and wood. A bundle of letters tied with string that had turned brown with age. "There's writing on the chest," she said, pointing to an engraved brass plate on the interior of the lid. The letters were ornate, difficult to read in the dim light. "Property of Captain Ezekiel Thorne, 1887. Expedition to—" She trailed off, squinting. The rest was too corroded to read. 1887, Walter repeated. He pulled out his phone, the screen's glow casting strange shadows across his weathered face. His thick fingers, still nimble despite the arthritis, moved across the screen with surprising dexterity. "Ezekiel Thorne. Let me see if—" Margaret watched him search, her heart still hammering in her chest. Around them, the storage unit stretched into shadow, a 10 by 15 space crammed with the detritus of someone's life. Furniture covered in dusty sheets, steamer trunks, hat boxes, an old gramophone. shelves of books that looked like they hadn't been touched since Eisenhower was president. They'd barely made a dent in cataloging it all. "Holy hell," Walter said softly. He turned the phone toward her, and she had to fish her reading glasses from her cardigan pocket to see the screen clearly. It was a Wikipedia page, sparse but intriguing. Ezekiel Thorne, 1861 to 1887, was an American explorer and naturalist known for his expedition to the Amazon basin in 1886. Thorne disappeared during his return journey, and his body was never recovered. His work included botanical surveys and anthropological studies of indigenous peoples. Little is known about his final expedition, as most of his journals and specimens were lost. 1887, Margaret said again. The same year on the chest. Walter, you don't think that this is his skull? Walter's eyes moved from the phone to the chest to his wife's face. I think we need to be very careful about what we're dealing with here. They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of history pressing down on them. Outside, they could hear the distant sound of traffic on Route 1, the normal world continuing its mundane rotation while they stood in this fluorescent-lit tomb of secrets. Margaret's practical nature reasserted itself. We need to document this, everything, before we touch anything else. She pulled out her own phone, older and more battered than Walter's, and began taking photographs. The chest, the skull, the brass plate, the scattered contents visible beneath the bones. We should call someone, Walter said, echoing her earlier thought. A museum, maybe? Or a historical society? And tell them what? That we bought someone's storage unit and found human remains? Margaret continued photographing, her hands steadier now that she had a task. They'll take it all away, Walter. They'll ask questions. They might even think we did something wrong. We didn't do anything wrong. You think that matters? She lowered her phone, looking at him with those sharp blue eyes that had first caught his attention at a church social in 1971. We're two old people who can barely pay their electric bill, rooting through dead people's belongings. You think the authorities are going to assume we're on the up and up? Walter ran a hand through his thinning white hair, a gesture of frustration she'd seen 10,000 times. So what do you suggest? Margaret looked back at the chest, at the skull that had waited so long in the darkness. We research. We figure out what this is, who it belonged to, why it ended up in a storage unit in Portland, Maine. Then we decide what to do with it. She paused. Besides, you read the Wikipedia page. If this really is from Ezekiel Thorne's expedition, if these are his lost journals and specimens, this could be historically significant. Or it could be grave robbery, Walter countered. It's not robbery if you buy it legally at an auction. She set her jaw in that stubborn way that told him the argument was over. 1 week. We give ourselves 1 week to figure out what this is. Then we go to the authorities, or a museum, or whoever needs to know. Fair? Walter looked at his wife, at the determined set of her shoulders, despite the osteoporosis that had curved her spine. At the fire still burning in her eyes, despite 77 years of life that hadn't always been kind. He thought of their empty bank account, of the stack of bills on their kitchen table, of the pride that kept them awake at night, worrying instead of asking their children for help. 1 week, he agreed. Margaret nodded and turned back to the chest, carefully using a pen from her purse to lift the edge of the leather journal. We do this right. We don't disturb anything more than necessary. We document everything. We treat this with respect. Agreed. Walter moved beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched, a familiar comfort after more than half a century together. Should we take the chest back to the house? God, no. Sarah comes by twice a week. You want to explain to our daughter why we have a skull in our living room? Margaret shook her head. We work here. We come every day. We're careful. They spent the next hour carefully photographing the chest and its contents from every angle, neither of them willing to remove the skull just yet. It felt like a boundary that, once crossed, would commit them to a course they couldn't reverse. Instead, they explored the rest of the storage unit, finding more mundane objects that nonetheless spoke of a long and unusual life. There were books on natural history, their pages yellowed and brittle. A collection of botanical specimens pressed between sheets of paper, flowers and leaves turned to brown shadows of their former selves. Maps, dozens of them, hand-drawn and annotated in a precise, archaic script. Photographs in oval frames showing stern-faced Victorians in formal dress. And everywhere, the smell of age and decay, of time passing and memories fading. "Look at this," Walter said from the back corner of the unit. He was examining a steamer trunk much newer than the chest, probably from the 1940s. Inside were more modern items. Newspapers from 1952, the year the Wikipedia page said the storage unit's owner had died. A will, or what looked like one. Correspondence with lawyers and historical societies. "Maggie, come look at this." She made her way through the cluttered space, her hip aching from standing so long. Walter held up a letter, the paper thick and official-looking. "It's from the Smithsonian," he said, dated March 1951. "They're declining to accept a donation of alleged materials from the Thorn expedition due to lack of provenance and serious questions regarding authenticity." He looked up at her. "Someone tried to donate this stuff to a museum, and they turned it down." Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. Who was the owner of this unit? The person who died in 1952? Walter shuffled through more papers. Here, death certificate. Cornelius Thorn, died November 14, 1952, age 79. Survived by no immediate family. He paused. Thorn, same last name as the explorer. Son? Margaret suggested. Grandson? Could be, Walter continued reading. There's a note here, looks like it was written by Cornelius himself. It's clipped to the death certificate. He cleared his throat and read aloud. To whom it may concern. I am the son of Ezekiel Thorn, the explorer who disappeared in 1887. For 65 years, I have been the keeper of my father's final legacy, a burden I no longer wish to carry. These materials should be preserved by those who understand their significance, but I have failed to find such custodians. May God forgive what we brought back from the darkness, and may whoever finds this have the wisdom I lacked. The fluorescent lights flickered, and Margaret felt goosebumps rise on her arms despite the stuffy warmth of the unit. What we brought back from the darkness, she repeated. Walter, what does that mean? Her husband folded the letter carefully, his engineer's hands precise despite their trembling. I don't know, but I think we need to read that journal. They returned to the chest, standing over it like archaeologists at a dig site, aware that what they did next might destroy something irreplaceable or unleash something better left buried. The skull watched them with empty eyes, and Margaret found herself wondering whose it was. An indigenous person Thorn had encountered, a fellow expedition member who hadn't made it home, or something else entirely. Together, she said, reaching for the journal at the same time Walter did. Their hands touched, wrinkled and spotted with age, and together they lifted the leather-bound book from its resting place beside the skull. The cover was inscribed in fading gold leaf, The Private Journal of Ezekiel Thorn, Naturalist. Expedition to the Upper Amazon, September 1886, April 1887. Margaret carefully opened to the first page, her reading glasses sliding down her nose. The handwriting was small and precise. The ink faded to brown, but still legible. September 3rd, 1886, she read aloud. We departed Manaus today, our party consisting of myself, my guide Juan, 2 bearers, and Dr. Richard Ashford, a physician from Boston who fancies himself an adventurer. Our objective: to reach the territory spoken of by the Takuna elders, where they claim a people live who have never had contact with the outside world, and where plants grow that have properties unlike any known to Western science. Ashford is here for glory. Juan is here for money. The bearers are here because they have no choice. I am here because I cannot bear to die without knowing what lies beyond the map's edge. Walter leaned over her shoulder, reading along. He sounds lonely. He sounds obsessed, Margaret corrected. She turned the page carefully. Listen to this. September 15th. We are 3 days beyond the last mission station. Juan warns we are entering territory where even the indigenous peoples fear to travel. He speaks of a tribe that collects heads, that worships something ancient and terrible. I have dismissed his concerns as superstition, but I confess the forest here feels different. Wrong, somehow. The birds are silent. Even the insects seem subdued. They read on, standing in the storage unit as the afternoon light outside faded to evening. The journal chronicled a journey that became increasingly strange and disturbing. Thorne wrote of finding plants with unusual properties, hallucinogenic flowers, trees that seemed to bleed, fungi that glowed with an eerie phosphorescence. He documented the growing tension within his party, Dr. Ashford's deteriorating mental state, Joao's increasing reluctance to continue. Then came the entry that changed everything. October 7th, Margaret read, her voice dropping to barely more than a whisper. We have found them. Or perhaps they found us. The city, if it can be called such, is unlike anything I have seen in my travels. Stone structures overgrown with vegetation, built in a style that predates any indigenous culture I have studied. And the people, they are wrong. That is the only word I can use. Wrong in their proportions, in their movements, in the way they look at us with eyes that seem to understand far too much. Dr. Ashford wants to flee. I want to stay. Joao has become unreachable, speaking in tongues, his eyes glassy with terror or ecstasy, I cannot tell which. Tomorrow I will attempt to communicate with their leader, the one they call the Keeper of Waters. Tomorrow I will learn their secrets, or die trying. Margaret stopped reading, her finger marking the place on the page. Walter, I don't like this. Keep going, he said quietly. We need to know what happened. She turned the page, and her breath caught. The next entry was written in a different hand, shakier, the letters sprawling across the page as if the writer had been in great distress. October 10th. This is Dr. Richard Ashford writing in Thorne's journal as he has become incapable of coherent record-keeping. 3 days ago, we participated in what Thorne insisted was a ceremony of fellowship with the indigenous people. We drank something they gave us, ate food prepared in their manner. Since then, Thorne has been changed. He speaks of visions, of understanding the true nature of the world. He is taken to walking into the jungle alone, returning with specimens he claims are gifts from the beyond. The bearers have fled. Joan is dead. Whether from fever or foul play, I cannot determine. I am alone with Thorne, and I fear him. I fear what he has become, and I fear what he plans to bring back to civilization. I must find a way to stop him before... The ending ended abruptly, the sentence unfinished. "Oh, God," Margaret said. Walter was already reaching for the next page, but Margaret grabbed his wrist. "Wait, do we really want to know? Maybe Cornelius was right. Maybe this should stay buried." "It's too late for that, Maggie. We've already opened the box." He gently freed his hand and turned the page. The next entries were back in Thorne's handwriting, but changed, more erratic, the letters sometimes overlapping, strange symbols appearing in the margins that looked like nothing Margaret had ever seen. The content was even more disturbing. October 15th. Ashford tried to destroy my specimens. I had to stop him. I had no choice. He didn't understand. None of them understand. What I've discovered here changes everything. The Keeper showed me the truth that lies beneath the world, the reality that predates humanity, that will exist long after we're gone. I am the bridge. I am the one who will bring this knowledge home. The skull of the Keeper is my proof, my key, my burden. It speaks to me now, even in death. It shows me things, beautiful, terrible things. Margaret felt sick. She looked down at the skull in the chest, its empty eye sockets suddenly seeming less empty, as if something were looking out from within them. "He killed Dr. Ashford," she said, "and he took the skull from this Keeper person. He murdered someone and desecrated their remains." "That's what it sounds like." Walter's face was pale. "Keep reading. We need to know how it ends." The final entries in the journal were brief and increasingly incoherent. Thorne wrote of his journey back to civilization, traveling alone, the skull wrapped in the rotting velvet, the specimens carefully preserved. He wrote of fevers and hallucinations, of voices in the jungle, of the certainty that he was being followed by something that wanted its property returned. The last entry was dated April 2nd, 1887. "I am dying. The fever has consumed me, but I have made it to Manaus. Tomorrow I will send my findings to my son Cornelius via steamship. He will know what to do with them. He will understand their significance. The skull must be preserved. It is the key to everything. I only regret that I will not live to see the world transformed by what I have learned. To whoever reads this, do not fear the knowledge. Embrace it. The boundaries between worlds are thinner than you know, and what waits on the other side is neither good nor evil. It simply is, and it is magnificent." Margaret closed the journal with trembling hands. He died in Manaus. And his son received all of this, the skull, the journals, the specimens, and spent the rest of his life trying to give it away. "But nobody would take it," Walter finished, "because it was too crazy, too unverifiable, too wrong." They stood in silence, the implications settling over them like a heavy blanket. Margaret thought of Cornelius Thorne, a young man, probably only in his 20s when his father's final package arrived, spending 6 decades as the custodian of this nightmare legacy, trying and failing to pass it on, finally dying alone with all of it locked away in a storage unit, hoping someone wiser would find it. "What do we do?" she asked quietly. Walter looked at the chest, at the skull, at the journal in Margaret's hands. "We have options. We could still go to the authorities, turn it over to a museum, let them sort out the provenance and the ethics." "They'd take it all away," Margaret said, "and probably accuse us of something in the process." You know how institutions are. They'd rather bury something difficult than deal with the complexity. "We could destroy it," Walter suggested, though his tone said he didn't really mean it. "Bury the skull, burn the journals, forget we ever found any of it." "Could you forget?" Margaret asked. "After reading that? After seeing what we've seen?" He was quiet for a long moment. "No." Margaret felt a sudden, fierce determination. "Then we do what Cornelius Thorne couldn't. We research properly. We verify what we can. We treat this with respect but not fear. And if it is historically significant, if there's something here that needs to be preserved, we find the right people to give it to. People who will handle it ethically, who will acknowledge the harm that was done in its acquisition, but also recognize the value of the knowledge." "That's a tall order, Maggie." "So was 53 years of marriage, but we managed," she smiled, and he couldn't help but smile back. "1 week, like we said. We treat this like the research project it is. No jumping to conclusions, no getting spooked, No making decisions based on fear. Walter nodded slowly. Okay, but we set some ground rules. We don't touch the skull more than necessary. We don't take anything home. We work during daylight hours only. And if anything, and I mean anything, starts to feel wrong or dangerous, we stop immediately. Deal. Margaret held out her hand, and they shook on it, a formal gesture that felt appropriate given the gravity of what they were undertaking. They spent another hour organizing their approach. Walter would research Ezekiel Thorne, trying to verify the expedition, finding any historical records that might corroborate the journal. Margaret would examine the physical evidence, the specimens, the maps, the navigational instruments, and try to determine their authenticity and age. They would photograph everything, maintain detailed notes, and proceed with the kind of methodical care that had served Walter well in his 40 years as an engineer and Margaret in her 30 years as a librarian. By the time they locked up the storage unit and drove home in their aging Honda, the sun had set completely. Neither of them spoke much during the drive, both lost in thought, the journal's words echoing in their minds. That night, Margaret dreamed of jungles and stone cities, of eyes watching from the darkness, of a skull that whispered secrets in a language she almost understood. She woke, gasping at 3 a.m., Walter's hand immediately on her shoulder, grounding her. "Just a dream," he murmured. "It was just a dream." But as she lay there in the darkness, listening to her husband's breathing settle back into sleep, Margaret wasn't entirely sure that was true. The next morning dawned gray and cold, typical for Maine in late October. Margaret made coffee while Walter sat at their kitchen table with his laptop, already deep in research. Their kitchen was small and cluttered with the comfortable chaos of a long marriage. Photos of children and grandchildren on the walls, Walter's blood pressure medication next to the sugar bowl, Margaret's collection of ceramic chickens on the windowsill that she'd been accumulating for decades. "Found something," Walter said without preamble when she set his coffee down. "There's more than that Wikipedia stub. Someone at the University of Sao Paulo wrote a paper about North American explorers in the Amazon during the 1880s. Thorne gets a mention. Says he was considered competent but reckless, that he had a reputation for going further into the interior than was safe." Margaret sat down with her own coffee, her reading glasses already perched on her nose. "Does it mention his death?" "Only that he died of fever in Manaus in April 1887, which matches the journal." But here's the interesting part. The author notes that Thorne claimed to have discovered a previously uncontacted indigenous group, but there was never any verification. No specimens, no documentation, nothing. The academic community dismissed it as delusion brought on by illness. "Because his son couldn't get anyone to take the material seriously," Margaret said. "Right, so everything Cornelius tried to donate was tainted by the assumption that his father had gone mad." Walter scrolled through more results. There's also a reference to Dr. Richard Ashford in a book about 19th-century medical practitioners. Says he departed for South America in 1886 as part of an expedition led by Ezekiel Thorne and was never heard from again. His family spent years trying to find out what happened to him. Margaret felt a pang of sorrow. He had people who loved him, who wanted him home, and instead he died in the jungle, probably murdered by his expedition leader, and his family never knew what happened. "We don't know for sure that Thorne killed him," Walter said, though his tone suggested he believed it was likely. "The journal entry was ambiguous. 'I had to stop him,'" Margaret quoted. "That's not ambiguous, Walter. That's a confession." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of it pressing down on them. They were dealing with more than just a historical curiosity. This was a crime scene, albeit one that was more than a century old. "We should tell someone," Margaret said finally, "about Dr. Ashford. His family deserves to know." "His family is probably long dead," Walter pointed out. "But you're right, this is bigger than just us. We need to be responsible about this." Margaret stood, carrying her coffee to the window. Outside, the maple tree in their backyard was shedding its last leaves, the branches becoming skeletal against the gray sky. After the week, we'll do our research, we'll document everything properly, and then we'll go to the right people. The university, maybe, or a historical society that specializes in this era. The Smithsonian turned Cornelius down, Walter reminded her. That was 1951, and he probably didn't present it well. We have more resources now. Internet, better authentication techniques, people who specialize in exactly this kind of thing. She turned back to him. We can do this right, Walter. We can give Dr. Ashford's family closure, honor what's valuable about the expedition, and condemn what was wrong about it. Both things can be true. Walter nodded, closing his laptop. When did you get so wise? About 53 years ago, when I agreed to marry you. She smiled, but it faded quickly. I need to tell you something. I had dreams last night about the jungle, the skull. It felt real. I did too, Walter admitted. Probably just our subconscious processing what we read. It was disturbing material. Probably, Margaret agreed, but neither of them sounded convinced. They spent the rest of the morning preparing for another trip to the storage unit. Margaret packed supplies, gloves, evidence bags she'd ordered online years ago for handling antique books, archival-quality tissue paper, LED lanterns to improve the lighting. Walter printed out a research checklist and gathered his camera equipment, including a macro lens for photographing small details. By noon, they were back at the storage facility, a sprawling complex of units on the outskirts of Portland. The manager, a bored young man with headphones permanently attached to his skull, barely looked up as they signed in. They were just another elderly couple trying to squeeze value from other people's discarded lives. Inside Unit 247, everything was as they'd left it. The chest sat in the center of the space where they'd moved it, the skull visible through the open lid. In the daylight streaming through the open door, it looked less sinister and more sad, a remnant of a person who had died far from home, whose remains had been stolen and carried halfway around the world. Let's start with the specimens, Margaret said, moving to a shelf where they'd identified several boxes of preserved plant material. If we can verify that these plants are actually from the Amazon, that's evidence supporting the journal's authenticity. She worked carefully, photographing each specimen, noting the state of preservation, the method of pressing, the annotations in Thorne's handwriting. Many of the plants had deteriorated badly. A century and a half in a storage unit, even a carefully packed one, took its toll. But some were still identifiable, at least to someone with botanical knowledge. "I'll need to consult with someone," she said, "maybe the botany department at the university. I can say I'm researching a historical collection without going into specifics." Walter was examining the navigational instruments, a sextant, a compass, several items Margaret couldn't identify. "These are genuine Victorian era, I'm pretty sure. The craftsmanship is right, and they show appropriate wear." He turned the sextant carefully in his hands. This would have been expensive in its day, a serious explorer's equipment. As the afternoon wore on, they fell into a rhythm. Document, photograph, catalog. It was meticulous work, the kind that would have bored their younger selves, but that they now found oddly soothing. There was comfort in process, in the systematic unraveling of mystery. It was Walter who found the letters. They were in a smaller box, tucked beneath the steamer trunk. A bundle of correspondence, yellow with age, tied with ribbon that crumbled at his touch. He carried them carefully to where Margaret had set up a workspace on a folding table they'd brought from home. "These are letters to Cornelius," Walter said, "from his father." Margaret's hands stilled. "From before the expedition?" "During, I think. Look at the postmarks." She examined them carefully. They were addressed to Cornelius Thorne in Boston, sent from various locations in Brazil: Belém, Manaus, São Gabriel de Cachoeira. The earliest was dated June 1886, the latest January 1887, just months before Ezekiel's death. "He was writing home during the expedition," Margaret said softly. "Should we read them?" Walter hesitated. "They're historical documents now, and we need to understand the full context." Margaret untied the first letter carefully, unfolding the brittle paper. The handwriting was the same as in the journal, but less hurried, more careful. This was correspondence meant to be read by a beloved son, not just a record for posterity. She read aloud. "My dearest Cornelius, I write this from Manaus as I prepare to venture further into the interior than any American has yet traveled. I know you worry for me, as any good son would, but I must ask you to trust in my preparations and my purpose. Science advances not by caution but by courage, and I have both in sufficient measure. Should anything happen to me, know that I go into the unknown freely and gladly, driven by a hunger for knowledge that has defined my life. You have been a better son than I deserved, patient with my long absences and my obsessions. Whatever comes, know that I am proud of the man you have become." Margaret's voice caught on the last words. He loved his son. "Keep going," Walter said gently. The letters chronicled Thorne's journey, his excitement at the discoveries he was making, his growing conviction that he was on the verge of something extraordinary. They were the letters of a man intoxicated by possibility, by the romance of exploration, by the certainty that he was going to make his mark on history. The tone changed in the later letters. "January 12th, 1887, Margaret read. "Cornelius, I have seen things that defy rational explanation. Dr. Ashford believes I am suffering from fever dreams, but I am more lucid now than I have ever been. The people I have encountered possess knowledge that predates our civilization. That suggests our understanding of history is profoundly incomplete. I am bringing evidence home, specimens, artifacts, proof that cannot be denied. The skull I carry is not merely a curio, but a key to understanding truths that science has yet to discover. I know this will sound mad, but I beg you to trust me. When I return, you will see. You will understand. And together, we will reveal to the world what has been hidden for so long." Margaret set the letter down. He believed it all. It wasn't just fever or delusion. He genuinely thought he'd discovered something world-changing. "Or he was very sick," Walter countered. "Fever can cause hallucinations, paranoia, delusions of grandeur. We can't take his word at face value. But what if some of it was true?" Margaret looked at the chest, at the skull. What if he did find an uncontacted group? What if there were genuine scientific discoveries buried in all the madness? "Then we need to separate fact from fiction," Walter said. "That's what we're here to do." They continued working through the afternoon, breaking only for sandwiches they'd brought from home. The more they uncovered, the more complex the picture became. Ezekiel Thorne had been a real explorer, a credentialed naturalist with legitimate achievements. His expedition had been properly outfitted and professionally planned. Everything suggested a serious scientific endeavor. Until it all went wrong. By late afternoon, Margaret's back was aching and Walter's fingers were cramping from taking notes. They documented perhaps a third of the chest's contents and hadn't even begun on the rest of the storage unit. This was going to take much longer than a week. "We should think about hiring someone to help," Walter said, stretching his back with an audible crack. "And tell them what? That we found a potentially stolen skull and evidence of a murder from 1887? Margaret shook her head. "No, not yet. We need to understand this better first, get our facts straight. Otherwise, well, we'll just sound like crazy old people." "We are crazy old people," Walter pointed out. "Sane old people would have called the police on day one." Margaret laughed despite herself. Fair point. They were packing up for the day when Walter found the photographs. They were in a leather portfolio, the kind Victorian photographers used to carry their work. Inside were perhaps 24 images, each one carefully mounted on heavy cardstock. They were formal portraits, expedition photographs, the kind that would have been produced by a professional photographer traveling with the expedition. Except there was no mention of a photographer in Thorne's journal. The first few photos were unremarkable. Thorne himself, a lean man with intense eyes and a thick beard, standing beside native guides. Dr. Ashford, younger than Margaret had imagined, with a soft face that suggested he was unprepared for the hardships he would face. Various shots of the expedition's camp, their supplies, the river they'd traveled. Then Walter turned to a photograph that made them both go still. It showed a clearing in the jungle, and in that clearing, stone structures unlike anything Margaret had seen in her years of looking at historical photographs. They were ancient-looking, but not primitive, sophisticated in their construction, covered in intricate carvings that, even in the faded photograph, looked wrong somehow, the proportions and angles unsettling to the eye. And in the foreground, arranged in a line, were people. They were tall, taller than Thorne, who stood among them for scale. Their features were obscured by what looked like elaborate ceremonial dress, masks perhaps, or headdresses, though the details were hard to make out in the century-old image. But their posture, their bearing, something about them made Margaret's skin crawl. "What are we looking at?" Walter whispered. "I don't know," Margaret said. "But Thorne was telling the truth about at least part of it. He did find something. These aren't staged photos. You can see the genuine structures, the authentic setting. This was real." Walter carefully removed the photograph from its mounting and flipped it over. On the back, in Thorne's handwriting, "The Keepers and Their City, October 6, 1886, one day before the ceremony." One day before everything went wrong. They looked at several more photographs, each one more disturbing than the last. The structures grew more elaborate, more alien in their architecture. More of the tall figures appeared, always in their ceremonial dress, always positioned in ways that seemed deliberately unsettling. And in the last photograph, there was Thorne himself, standing beside one of the figures, both of them holding what looked like a human skull. The same skull that now rested in the chest before them. "We need to get these analyzed," Walter said, his voice tight, "professionally, to verify they haven't been tampered with, that they're actually from the 1880s. Margaret nodded, unable to take her eyes off the image of Thorne in the skull. In the photograph, Thorne was smiling, his eyes bright with triumph or madness. It was impossible to tell which. They locked up the storage unit in silence, both of them feeling the weight of what they'd discovered. This wasn't just a historical curiosity anymore. This was evidence of something significant, a genuine exploration that had uncovered something the world had never seen, followed by tragedy and theft and a cover-up that had lasted for more than a century. In the car, Margaret finally spoke. "We're in over our heads." "Yes," Walter agreed, "but we're still doing this." "Yes," she echoed, "we're still doing this." That night, the dreams came again, but this time they came to both of them, and when they woke in the dark hours before dawn, they knew without speaking that they'd dreamed the same thing. Stone structures in a jungle clearing, the skull on its bed of velvet, and a voice that spoke in a language neither of them knew but somehow understood, saying over and over, "The keeper wants to go home." The third day, Margaret contacted Professor Elena Santos at the University of Maine, claiming to be researching a collection of Victorian-era botanical specimens for a book club project. It was a thin lie, but it got her foot in the door. Professor Santos, intrigued by Margaret's description of the pressed plants, agreed to meet her that afternoon. Margaret brought a selection of the better-preserved specimens, carefully packaged in archival folders. She didn't mention the skull, the journal, or the photographs. Just a woman researching her hobby, nothing more. Professor Santos was younger than Margaret expected, perhaps 50, with gray-streaked black hair and sharp, intelligent eyes. Her office in the biology building was cluttered with plants. Living specimens on every surface, dried ones in frames on the walls, the air thick with the smell of earth and green things. "These are remarkable," Santos said immediately, examining the first specimen under a magnifying lamp. "The preservation is poor, but the pressing technique is excellent. Victorian era? 1880s, I believe, possibly from South America." Santos looked up sharply. "You have provenance?" "Some documentation, yes. I'm still verifying it." The professor returned to the specimens, her excitement palpable. If these are authentic, if they're actually from an 1880s Amazon expedition, they could be quite valuable, not just monetarily, scientifically. Many species have gone extinct since then, and the botanical knowledge of indigenous peoples that was documented in that era has been lost. She spent an hour examining each specimen, taking notes, occasionally photographing something with a high-resolution camera. Margaret watched, fascinated by the professor's obvious passion for her work. "This one," Santos said finally, holding up a particularly well-preserved flower, its petals still showing traces of deep purple coloring. "I don't recognize it. The structure suggests it's from the Solanaceae family, nightshades, but the flower morphology is unusual." She looked at Margaret intently. "Where exactly did you say these came from?" "I'm not entirely sure," Margaret said, which was technically true. "The documentation I have suggests the upper Amazon, possibly near the Brazilian-Colombian border." Santos nodded slowly. "There are regions up there that are still poorly documented botanically. New species are being discovered regularly." She paused. "Mrs. Abbott, if these specimens are authentic, and if you have documentation connecting them to a specific expedition, you should really be talking to an institution that can preserve and study them properly, not just a community college professor." "I'm working on that," Margaret assured her, "but I needed to verify they were real first. I didn't want to waste anyone's time with forgeries or misattributed materials." "These aren't forgeries," Santos said firmly. "I'd bet my tenure on it. The preservation methods alone date them correctly. We didn't use these techniques after about 1920, and the specimens themselves show authentic aging, not artificial distressing." She handed the folders back carefully. "Whatever you have, it's real, and it's important. Please promise me you'll contact the appropriate people." "I will," Margaret said. "Thank you for your time, Professor." Walking back to her car, Margaret felt a mixture of vindication and worry. The specimens were real, which meant Thorne's expedition was real, which meant everything in the journal might be real, including the murder. She found Walter at home, buried in research on his laptop, papers spread across the kitchen table. Had spent the day digging into Dr. Richard Ashford's background, trying to piece together the man whose fate had been sealed in a jungle a century and a half ago. He was 32, Walter said without preamble, recently married. His wife, Catherine, spent years trying to find out what happened to him. She hired private investigators, wrote letters to the State Department, contacted everyone she could think of. She died in 1920, never knowing. Margaret set down her bag heavily. "The specimens are authentic. Professor Santos confirmed it." They looked at each other across the cluttered kitchen, the weight of their knowledge pressing down on them. "We have to tell his story," Margaret said quietly. "Dr. Ashford deserves that much. His wife deserves that much." "How?" Walter asked. "We have a journal that suggests murder but doesn't explicitly say it. We have a skull that might be from an indigenous person or might be from this keeper Thorne kept talking about. We have specimens and photographs that prove an expedition happened, but not what happened on it." "We keep researching," Margaret said. "We find every piece of evidence we can. We build a case that's so thorough, so well documented, that when we do go public, no one can dismiss it." Walter nodded slowly. "Then we need to look at the rest of the storage unit. There might be more we haven't found yet." They returned to the unit that evening, working by the light of their LED lanterns as the sun set outside. They'd been focused on the chest and its contents, but the unit held decades of accumulation from Cornelius Thorne's life. In a corner, buried under a dusty tarp, they found it. A second trunk, smaller than the first, with Cornelius' name painted on the lid. Inside were his own journals spanning from 1887 to the early 1950s. Decades of his life, recorded in a careful, scholarly hand that stood in stark contrast to his father's erratic script. Margaret opened the first journal, dated 1887, the year he received his father's final shipment. June 14, 1887, she read. Today I received a crate from Manaus containing my father's final effects. I had prepared myself for grief, but not for this. Not for the skull, the mad journal entries, the specimens that seemed to defy natural law. My father died believing he had discovered something magnificent. I am left wondering if he discovered only his own madness. The entries continued, chronicling Cornelius's struggle with his inheritance. He tried to have the materials authenticated, approaching museums and universities, but the skull and journal entries were too controversial. People either dismissed him as delusional like his father, or suggested he was perpetrating a hoax. March 3, 1889, Walter read from a later journal. I have decided to preserve Father's collection privately. Whatever the truth of what he found, he believed in its importance, and I owe him that much respect. I will not see his legacy thrown in a trash heap or locked in some museum basement, forgotten. I will be its keeper, as he was before me. Year after year, the entries continued. Cornelius married, had no children, worked as a clerk in a shipping company. His life was ordinary except for this extraordinary burden he carried, the mysterious collection he couldn't donate and wouldn't destroy. The later entries, from the 1940s and 50s, showed a man wrestling with mortality and legacy. November 2, 1951, Margaret read, I am 78 years old and in failing health. I have spent 64 years as the guardian of my father's secret, and I am no closer to understanding it now than I was at 24. The Smithsonian has declined my donation. The Harvard Museum of Natural History will not even respond to my letters. I am running out of options and running out of time. Perhaps I was wrong to preserve this collection. Perhaps Father's madness should have been buried with him. The final entry, dated November 1952, just days before his death, was short. I have placed everything in a storage facility. Let fate decide what becomes of it. To whoever finds this, I pray you are wiser than I was. I pray you know what to do with knowledge that burns. I carried my father's burden for 65 years, and I am grateful to finally set it down. Margaret closed the journal, tears surprising her. He tried. For his whole life he tried to do right by his father's legacy, and nobody would listen. And now it's our burden, Walter said softly. They sat in silence, surrounded by the accumulated weight of 2 lifetimes of secret-keeping, of trying and failing to make the world understand. We are going to do better, Margaret said finally, with determination. We are going to tell this story the right way. Cornelius tried to donate it to institutions that didn't want the complexity. We're living in a different time now. People understand that history is messy, that explorers did terrible things, that indigenous peoples were exploited and murdered. We can acknowledge all of that while still preserving what's scientifically valuable. Walter reached across the space between them and took her hand. So, we keep going. We keep going. They worked late into the night, photographing Cornelius's journals, creating a timeline of events, building their case piece by piece. By the time they locked up the unit and drove home under a sky brilliant with stars, they had a plan. They would document everything thoroughly. They would consult experts, carefully, anonymously where necessary, to verify the authenticity of the materials. They would research Dr. Ashford's family, see if any descendants survived who might want closure. They would find an institution that would handle the collection with the respect and complexity it deserved. And they would tell the truth, all of it. The brilliance and the madness, the discovery and the crime, the decades of secret keeping and the burden of inherited guilt. But that night, as they lay in bed waiting for sleep, Margaret whispered, "Do you hear it?" "Hear what?" Walter asked, though his voice suggested he already knew. "The skull, whispering. I know it's not real. I know it's just my mind processing stress, but I swear I can hear it." Walter was quiet for a long moment. Then, "I hear it too." They lay in the darkness, holding hands like frightened children, listening to a voice that might have been imagination or might have been something else, saying over and over in a language they didn't speak but somehow understood, "Home. Take me home." On the fourth day, Walter collapsed. They were at the storage unit, Margaret photographing the navigational instruments while Walter examined a set of maps Thorne had drawn of his route. One moment he was standing, tracing a river's course with his finger, and the next he was on the floor, clutching his chest, his face gray. "Walter!" Margaret dropped her camera and was beside him in an instant, her arthritis forgotten in the surge of adrenaline. "Walter, talk to me." "Chest. Tight," he gasped. "Can't breathe." She had her phone out, was dialing 911, her hands shaking so badly she almost dropped it. "I need an ambulance. My husband is having chest pain. Yes, he has a history of heart disease. Yes, he's conscious. Please hurry." The paramedics arrived within 10 minutes, but it felt like 10 hours. Margaret followed the ambulance to the hospital, terror making her reckless behind the wheel, running a red light she didn't even see until the car behind her honked. In the emergency room, she sat in a plastic chair and prayed for the first time in years. Not the rote prayers of church attendants, but real, desperate pleas. "Let him be okay. I'm not ready. We're not done yet. Please." 3 hours later, a cardiologist found her in the waiting room. "Mrs. Abbott, your husband is stable. He's had what we call unstable angina, not a full heart attack, but a serious warning sign. His heart isn't getting enough oxygen. We're going to keep him for observation and run some tests, but it looks like he's going to be okay." Margaret sagged in her chair, relief making her weak. "Can I see him?" Walter was in a hospital bed, hooked up to monitors, an IV in his arm. He looked old in a way he hadn't that morning, fragile, mortal, the engineer's certainty gone from his eyes. "Hey," he said weakly when he saw her. "You scared me," she said, taking his hand carefully, mindful of the IV line. "Scared myself," he tried to smile. "Guess I'm not as young as I used to be." "None of us are." She pulled a chair close to the bed. "The doctor says you need to rest, reduce stress." Walter was quiet for a moment. Then, "The chest." "What?" "The chest. This is because of the chest, isn't it? The stress of it all, the research, the secrets, the dreams. It's killing me, Maggie." She wanted to deny it, but she couldn't. "Maybe. Yes. Probably." "We need to stop," he said. "Turn it all over to someone else. This isn't worth dying for." Margaret thought about Cornelius Thorne, spending 65 years carrying his father's burden. About Dr. Ashford, who never made it home. About all the weight of secrets and stolen knowledge and crimes that had never been answered for. "You're right," she said quietly. "We'll stop. We'll call someone tomorrow. Turn it all over. I don't care anymore. I just want you to be okay." Walter closed his eyes, and for a moment she thought he'd fallen asleep. Then, "I'm sorry, Maggie." "For what?" "For dragging you into this, for being stubborn, for—" He trailed off. For being my husband for 53 years? She squeezed his hand gently. That's the one thing you don't need to apologize for. They kept Walter in the hospital for 2 days. The tests showed significant blockage in his arteries, not immediately life-threatening, but serious. The cardiologist recommended surgery, medication changes, lifestyle modifications. Walter nodded through it all, subdued in a way Margaret had never seen him. She stayed by his side as much as the hospital would allow, leaving only to go home and shower and feed their cat. She didn't go back to the storage unit, didn't look at her photographs or Walter's research notes, just sat in a hospital chair, reading magazines she didn't care about and listening to her husband breathe. On the second night, when Walter was sleeping and Margaret was drowsing in her chair, a nurse came in to check his vitals. She was young, maybe 30, with kind eyes. "You two have been married a long time?" she asked softly, checking the monitors. 53 years, Margaret answered. "That's beautiful." The nurse adjusted Walter's blanket. "My grandparents were married that long. Died within 6 months of each other. Couldn't bear to be apart." After she left, Margaret sat in the dark and thought about that, about what it would mean to lose Walter, to have to navigate the world alone after more than half a century of partnership, about how the storage unit and the skull and all of Ezekiel Thorne's secrets suddenly seemed trivial compared to that. But she also thought about Cornelius Thorne, dying alone with no one to pass his burden to, about Dr. Ashford's widow, dying without answers, about all the stories that ended unfinished, all the truths that got buried with the people who knew them. When Walter woke up, she was still sitting there, staring at nothing. "I can hear you thinking," he said, groggily. "Sorry, what are you thinking about?" She hesitated, then, "About finishing what we started." Walter was quiet for a long moment. "I thought we agreed to stop." "I know, and we will, if that's what you want. But I've been sitting here thinking about Cornelius, about how he spent his whole life trying to do the right thing and ended up dying alone with nothing resolved. I don't want that for us. I don't want to give up and spend the rest of our lives wondering what would have happened if we'd seen it through. Maggie, let me finish." She leaned forward, her elbows on her knees. "You had a health scare. It was scary, and it was a warning, and we need to take it seriously. But we also need to live, really live, not just exist. And for the first time in years, I feel like we've been living. This thing we've been doing, it's been hard and strange and sometimes frightening, but it's also been important. It's mattered." Walter reached for her hand, his grip weak but steady. "What are you suggesting?" "We finish the research, we get everything documented, and then we hand it over to the right people. Not dump it on them, but present it properly, with all our findings, all our verification. We see this through to the end, but we do it smart. No more long days in a cold storage unit, no more obsessing over journals at midnight. We take care of your health first, and we work on the collection second. You think we can do both? I think we have to try." She squeezed his hand. "Because the alternative is giving up, and that's not who we are. That's never been who we are." Walter smiled, the first genuine smile she'd seen since his collapse. "When did you get so wise?" "About 53 years ago," she said, repeating the old joke. And he laughed, which made the monitors beep in alarm, until a nurse came rushing in. They released Walter from the hospital the next day, with a pharmacy's worth of medications and strict orders to rest. Margaret drove him home carefully, navigating the autumn streets of their neighborhood like she was carrying precious cargo, which she was. Their daughter Sarah was waiting at the house, having driven up from Boston when Margaret called about the hospital. She fussed over Walter, made them lunch, tried to convince them to move in with her family. "We're fine, honey," Walter said. "Just getting old, that's all." "You scared me," Sarah said, and Margaret heard the little girl in her voice, the child who had once run to her father to fix every broken toy and scrape. Scared myself, Walter admitted. After Sarah left, reluctantly, with promises to check in daily, Margaret and Walter sat in their living room, the evening news playing on mute, neither of them really watching. "So," Walter said, "how do we do this?" "Carefully," Margaret said. "We contact Dr. Santos again, tell her the full story. We reach out to an anthropologist who specializes in South American indigenous peoples. We find a historian who focuses on 19th century exploration. We bring in the experts, let them guide us, take the burden off ourselves." "And the skull?" Margaret was quiet for a moment. "We try to figure out where it came from, what people or tribe. If there's any way to repatriate it, to send it home. That could take years." "Then it takes years." She looked at him. "We're not in a hurry. We're just trying to do right." Walter nodded slowly. "Okay, but first, I need you to promise me something." "What?" "No more dreams. No more whispering. We go to the storage unit during the day, we work for a few hours at most, and then we come home and live our normal lives. We don't let this consume us." "Deal," Margaret said, though she knew the dreams weren't something they could control. That night, they both slept soundly for the first time in days, too exhausted by hospital worry to dream of jungles and skulls and voices in languages they shouldn't understand. Over the next 2 weeks, they slowly, carefully resumed their work, but it was different now. They worked shorter hours, took frequent breaks, brought lunch and thermoses of coffee. Walter checked his blood pressure religiously, took his medications on schedule, rested when he felt tired instead of pushing through. Margaret contacted Professor Santos and told her more of the truth. Not everything, not yet, but enough. That they had a collection from an 1880s Amazon expedition, that it included human remains of questionable provenance, that they needed guidance on how to proceed ethically. To her credit, Santos didn't dismiss them or demand they hand everything over immediately. Instead, she put them in touch with Dr. James Chen, an anthropologist at Columbia University who specialized in indigenous Amazonian cultures, and Dr. Rebecca Moreno, a historian whose work focused on the ethics of museum collections and repatriation. Over video calls, Margaret and Walter shared what they'd found: the journal entries, the photographs, the letters, the specimens. They were honest about the circumstances: a purchased storage unit, a century of secret-keeping, a son's failed attempts to donate the collection properly. "This is extraordinary," Dr. Chen said after reviewing the photographs of the stone structures. "I've never seen architecture quite like this. The style doesn't match any known culture from that region and time period." "Could it be a hoax?" Walter asked. "The photographs are authentic Victorian era. I had our photo lab analyze the images you sent. Someone definitely photographed something in the 1880s. Whether what they photographed was what Thorne claimed it was, that's harder to say." Dr. Moreno was more focused on the ethical implications. "The skull is the biggest issue. If it's from an indigenous person, it was taken without consent, probably as part of what we'd now classify as a crime. The fact that it may have been taken from someone described as a keeper in the journal doesn't change that." "So what do we do?" Margaret asked. "We try to identify the origin," Moreno said. "DNA testing, anthropological analysis, comparison with known cultural practices from that region. If we can determine what people this individual came from, we can work toward repatriation. And if we can't?" Moreno was quiet for a moment. "Then, we do our best to treat the remains with respect while acknowledging the harm in how they were obtained. We tell the full story: the discovery, the probable murder of Dr. Ashford, the theft of the remains, the decades of attempted donation. We don't sanitize it or justify it. We just tell the truth." Over the following weeks, with guidance from the experts, Margaret and Walter systematically documented everything. They hired a professional photographer to properly image all the materials. They arranged for samples of the botanical specimens to be sent to multiple institutions for verification. They compiled a complete timeline of Ezekiel Thorne's expedition, Cornelius Thorne's life, and Dr. Ashford's disappearance. And slowly, carefully, they prepared to have the skull analyzed. Dr. Chen arranged for them to bring it to a forensic anthropology lab at Columbia, where it could be examined by specialists. The day they transported it from the storage unit, Margaret felt like they were performing a funeral service. She had Walter drive while she sat in the back seat, the chest carefully secured beside her, the skull wrapped in acid-free tissue paper. It felt wrong to just throw it in the trunk, to treat it like cargo.